The gavel cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Court is now in session. All rise, the bailiff barked, but no one moved. Not out of defiance, but disbelief. There, under the cold fluorescence of courtroom 6B, stood Sergeant Eli Wren. His hair was cropped short, his posture instinctively straight despite the tremor in his fingers. He wore his best shirt, buttoned to the top, but fraying at the cuffs. A single ribbon, his bronze star pinned to his chest above his heart, and in his right hand a crumpled photo of 3 men in desert camo. One of them, smiling, had half his face blown off 6 months later in Fallujah. Eli wasn't here to talk about the war. Not really. He was here because he'd stood outside Senator Marcus Langford's mansion with a sign that read, "You promised. We died waiting." No weapons, no shouting. Just the sign, the silence, and a folded flag in his backpack. Langford had once stared into a camera and vowed to fix the broken VA healthcare system. Then he voted no, again and again. A week later, Eli was arrested for violent trespassing and disorderly conduct, a made-up term to cover up political embarrassment, but that's not what shocked people. What shocked them came next. "Sergeant Wren," said Judge Harold Whitman from the bench, "you have one last opportunity to address the court before I render my verdict." Eli rose slowly. Every vertebrae in his back ached from injuries he'd stopped reporting years ago. His voice was low, gravelly, not from disobedience but from sand, smoke, and years of not being heard. "I served 3 tours, Iraq, Fallujah, Mosul. I watched men bleed out on my boots. I came home with their screams in my ears. I tried to be okay. I volunteered at the VA. I started a support group. I begged lawmakers to care. Senator Langford said he would. Then he didn't. He stopped, took a breath, swallowed the tremor. I didn't break in. I didn't scream. I just stood there with the names of the ones who didn't make it back. And you call that disorderly?" Silence. Judge Whitman leaned forward. His eyes, pale and calculating, narrowed into a smirk. "You done playing hero?" he said. "This isn't Veterans Day, Sergeant. It's a court of law. You're not fooling anyone with your crocodile tears." Eli's lips parted, stunned. A gasp rose from the back of the courtroom. One woman clutched her chest. A young man shook his head and muttered, "Unreal," as the judge continued. "You're not the only one who's seen war. We all carry burdens, but we don't use them as props. Save the theatrics. You're dismissed." It should have ended there. But fate was already moving. A door creaked open at the back of the room. All eyes turned. Boots echoed against the marble. Purposeful, heavy. A tall figure entered, military uniform pristine, ribbons glinting under courtroom lights. General Thomas Caldwell, commander of the 3rd Infantry Brigade, war hero, and the man whose life Eli had once saved under fire. The general stopped at the first row, glanced at the judge, then locked eyes with Eli, and he saluted. Every jaw in the room dropped, including the judges. Nobody saw that coming, and the trial, once a formality, just became a reckoning. There are wars that end with a signature on paper, and there are wars that don't. Eli Wren came home in 2012, but the desert never left him. He had a bag of medals in one hand, a pile of discharge paperwork in the other, and nowhere to go. The city had changed. The buildings were taller, the sidewalks shinier, but people looked past him now. Their eyes skated over the military haircut, the limp, the haunted stare, like he was invisible. Or worse, like he was someone to be pitied. He moved into a basement apartment in South Arlington, just 10 miles from the Capitol dome that once made him proud. He lived among boxes, kept the lights dim, slept in fits. Nightmares didn't knock. They barged in. When he wasn't fighting memories, he fought the system. At first, optimistically, patiently. The VA had lost his medical records, twice. He reapplied, waited 13 months for a PTSD diagnosis. He'd seen friends blow their own heads, off before their claims were even processed. He swore he wouldn't become one of them, so he fought the backlog with his own hands. He started volunteering at the local VA. 1 hour became 2, then 4, then 40. He'd sit with other veterans, men who shook like leaves, women who couldn't, talk above a whisper, and help them sort through the avalanche of forms. He taught himself how to read the system's code, how to nudge, how to demand. They called him the sergeant, not because of rank, because of presence. He started a group called Honor After Home. Weekly meetings in an old community center, folding chairs and lukewarm coffee, but inside it was sacred. No cameras, no pity, just stories, just truth. And still, despite all that, despite building something good, he couldn't forget Langford. Senator Marcus Langford had stood on stage with Eli once, smiled wide for the cameras, promised the Wren bill would pass, called it a personal mission. Then in a closed session, he caved, voted no, said the budget was too tight, said they'd revisit it next session. Eli didn't protest right away. He wrote letters, left voicemails, tried to get a meeting. Silence. 6 months later, 2 more vets from his group died by suicide. One had been waiting 18 months for trauma therapy. Eli snapped. He didn't break windows or scream slogans. He just walked to Langford's mansion, an ivory monstrosity in the heart of Georgetown, and stood outside with a single sign. "You promised, we died waiting." He stayed for 5 hours. No megaphone, no chance. Just him, the wind, and the photo of his unit. Police showed up. Eli didn't resist. He offered no explanation. The arrest was quiet, the report vague. Disorderly conduct. Trespassing on private grounds. The senator's team made sure it didn't hit the press. A PR nightmare avoided, but the damage was already done. Eli's support group tried to help, wrote character letters, reached out to lawyers, but the system, once again, was a machine that didn't care. The prosecutor seemed more interested in protecting the image of the senator than in asking why a decorated war hero was standing alone on a stranger's lawn. By the time the trial date came, Eli had almost accepted it. Maybe some part of him even wanted it, to go on record, to finally tell someone what it felt like to be discarded, but nothing could have prepared him for Judge Harold Whitman. The man was a monument of indifference, rumored to have never issued a single alternative sentence for nonviolent crimes, ran his courtroom like a factory, robotic, efficient, unmoved. Eli stood alone. No jury. Just a judge who'd already made up his mind until the door opened, and in came a ghost from his past, wearing medals and the weight of truth. General Caldwell's arrival cracked the courtroom's emotional dam. But beneath that drama, years of silence and pain lay buried, not just for Eli, but for every veteran watching. And now those ghosts were waking up. For months, Eli's name had barely been whispered outside the veteran circles. His protest didn't trend. No hashtags, no cable news frenzy. He wasn't photogenic enough, not broken enough, not dramatic enough. But someone was watching. It started with a blurry phone video, just 17 seconds long. Someone walking their dog outside Langford's house had captured it. A lone man, standing in front of the senator's gate, holding a cardboard sign. No shouting, just silence. The kind of silence that rattles louder than any chant. The clip found its way onto Reddit, then Twitter, then a veterans Facebook group with nearly 200,000 members. The caption read, "This man stood for us, alone." Comments exploded. "That's Wren, that's the Wren carried a general out of Fallujah, didn't he? Langford broke his promise. This is how we pay our own? I served with Eli, he's not disorderly, he's the reason I'm alive." By the next day, the video had 1 million views, and someone else saw it too. General Thomas Caldwell hadn't been in the public eye for years. He'd retired quietly after his final command overseas and settled into a life of silence, gardening, and trying to forget what war made of him. But the second he saw Eli's face, older now, worn down, but unmistakable, his breath caught. The image was impossible to forget. Eli dragging him, half-conscious, across an open Iraqi street under sniper fire. One arm useless, the other shielding Caldwell's head. Blood soaking through his uniform, refusing to stop, even as bullets snapped past them like angry bees. Caldwell didn't hesitate. He made calls, dug into case files, contacted Eli's attorney, wrote a statement and booked a flight. He hadn't worn his dress blues in 5 years. He pulled them out, ironed them flat, and stepped into the role one more time. When the courtroom doors opened and he entered, the room changed. Veterans recognized command like wolves know their alpha. Even Judge Whitman's stoic mask twitched. Caldwell walked straight to the witness stand. He raised his hand, swore in, then leaned toward the mic. "I am Major General Thomas Caldwell, United States Army, retired. I am here to speak on behalf of Sergeant Eli Wren and to correct this courtroom's catastrophic failure of understanding." He didn't need notes. His voice had the clipped certainty of a man used to issuing orders under fire. On July 19, 2008, I was wounded during an ambush outside Mosul. My convoy was hit by an IED. I was pinned in the wreckage. Eli Wren, then just 24 years old, disregarded a direct order to fall back. He ran through open fire, pulled me from the wreck, carried me 200 meters under sustained attack. He saved my life. You could hear the oxygen shift in the room. He wasn't done. After the war, Sergeant Wren did not disappear into bitterness. He built a veterans support network. He's personally helped hundreds navigate the VA system, volunteered 40 hours a week, no pay, no recognition. He turned to Eli. And when our government failed to live up to its promises, he did what all great soldiers do. He stood his ground, with courage and with honor. He looked back at the judge. This man does not belong in a courtroom. He belongs in history books. The silence after was total. No one breathed. Then one cough. Then a hand on a heart. Then a single stunned murmur. "That's the general. That's his general." What began as one quiet man with a sign now pulsed like a live wire across social media. Clips from the courtroom leaked. Veterans across the country began showing up at the courthouse, at Langford's office, in town halls. But it wasn't until the black shirts arrived that the world truly turned. 5 of them at first, then 10, then 50. No slogans, no flags, just black t-shirts that read, "Veterans, stand together." They filled the pews in silence, and they weren't alone. Because behind them came one final figure, older than all of them, still straight-backed, in full uniform, Lieutenant General Harold Whitman Sr., World War II hero, father of the judge. And he was about to do what no one dared imagine. He was going to break his silence, in public, against his own blood, for the sake of a man he'd never met, but immediately understood, because Eli Wren was every soldier he'd ever buried. And this was the beginning of the reckoning. The day after General Caldwell's testimony, Courtroom 6B was unrecognizable. Security tripled. Camera crews filled the hallway like a festival of lights and cables. Local stations had picked it up. Then CNN. Then a viral TikTok with 4.2 million views titled, "This judge laughed at a war hero, then this happened." Inside, the air buzzed. Rows of black shirts, veterans young and old, women with silver dog tags, Marines in worn-out boots, sat shoulder to shoulder in a silent phalanx. None spoke. Their message was written across their chests. Veterans stand together. Judge Whitman walked in 10 minutes late for the first time in years. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge his father, who now sat third-row center, in full military dress, hands clasped neatly in his lap like a folded flag. The tension wasn't theatrical. It was tectonic. Eli sat quietly at the defense table, his face unreadable. He hadn't spoken to the press, hadn't posted. He let others carry the fire now. But today his attorney would speak. Samantha Reyes wasn't a household name, but she'd built a reputation among public defenders as the one who never turned down a case no one else wanted. Her voice was calm, precise, like a surgeon peeling back layers of scar tissue. Your Honor, she began, standing before the bench. Yesterday, you heard testimony not just from a commanding officer, but from a witness to Sergeant Wren's courage, both in war and in peace. Today, I submit these official records. 104 hours of volunteer service at the VA. Over 300 veterans personally assisted with claims. Not one complaint, not one blemish. She held up the binder like scripture. The prosecution continues to argue that the law was broken, that property lines were crossed. But what law protects the powerful from the truth? What law says silence is more appropriate than grief? What law says standing still with a sign is more dangerous than sitting still in betrayal? The crowd didn't move, but someone sniffled. Then someone else cleared their throat. Reyes stepped closer to the bench. Sergeant Wren didn't act for attention. He acted because the voices of the fallen still echo in his bones, because promises were broken and no one listened. If this court punishes him, then we are not enforcing justice. We are enforcing silence. Judge Whitman didn't look up. The prosecution, a red-faced assistant district attorney named Hale, stood quickly. His rebuttal felt hollow. Intent is irrelevant. The law is the law. The defendant trespassed on private property. We can't make exceptions based on emotion. He didn't mention Eli's service, didn't mention the general, didn't dare look at the crowd. Emotion, Reyes said softly from her seat, is what buried 32 of my client's brothers in arms. And apathy is what nearly buried him. The judge called a recess. As he exited, his father's eyes followed him. Unmoving, not angry, just disappointed. The kind that burns deeper than rage. In the hallway, reporters shouted questions. But Eli didn't speak. He simply walked through the crowd. One hand brushed against a Vietnam vet's, another against a teenage girl wearing her father's tags. By the time court resumed, the hashtag #ImStandWithRen was trending worldwide. But inside the courtroom, the silence returned. Thick, charged, like a fuse waiting for the spark, and everyone could feel it. Someone was about to ignite it. The next morning, the courthouse looked like a war memorial had come to life. Flags waved on the sidewalk, not in protest, but in vigil. Lines wrapped around the block. A former Navy corpsman handed out coffee. A retired Green Beret led a prayer, in silence. Inside courtroom 6B, the gallery was already full. Veterans in uniform, families of the fallen, college students who'd seen the clips online. Some clutched photos. Others carried signs that read, "We are Wren." Even the judges' bench looked different today. Not because the wood had changed, but because, for the first time, Judge Harold Whitman was no longer the most feared presence in the room. That title now belonged to the man seated just 3 rows back, Lieutenant General Harold Whitman Sr. The elder Whitman had not addressed the court yet, but his silence thundered louder than the judge's gavel. At 10:05 a.m., court reconvened. Judge Whitman entered, robe swaying, jaw set in stone. But his eyes flickered, nervously, involuntarily, to his father. And the old man nodded. Not a greeting. A challenge. Judge Whitman cleared his throat. This court will now hear final statements before sentencing. Eli stood slowly. He had no notes. Just the weight of history on his shoulders. "I didn't come here looking for sympathy," he began, voice steady. "I came because I couldn't carry the silence anymore. I watched men die waiting for promises that never came. I carried their names with me, into offices, into phone calls, into prayer." He swallowed hard. The courtroom held its breath. When Senator Langford voted no again, I didn't get angry. I got scared. Because if someone like me, someone with medals, with connections, if I couldn't make them listen, what hope was there for the ones sleeping in their cars? For the ones overdosing in motel bathtubs? A woman in the gallery cried softly. A Marine beside her put a hand on her shoulder. Eli nodded toward the back. General Caldwell didn't have to come here. Neither did these men and women. But they did. Because they know this isn't about one protest. It's about being heard. He turned to the judge. "And Your Honor, Even if you can't see me as a hero, I hope you can see me as a man who tried." He sat down. The room exhaled like lungs unclenching after years underwater. Judge Whitman opened his mouth to speak, but another voice rang out from the back. Permission to address the court. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was the elder Whitman. "Lieutenant." General Harold Whitman Sr. stood slowly, spine straight as a flagpole. The bailiff hesitated, then stepped aside. Judge Whitman's face froze. "I suppose it's fitting," his father said, voice gravel but clear, "that I should use my last years to correct the worst mistake of mine." He stepped into the center aisle, medals gleaming, like defiant memories. "This young man," he said, pointing at Eli, "stood where others ran, spoke when others cowered. And my own son, a judge of this great nation, mocked him, laughed in his face." The silence cracked like glass under weight. "I taught my son discipline, precision, strength, but I failed to teach him reverence. For sacrifice, for pain, for the cost of silence." Judge Whitman's mouth trembled slightly, enough to be seen. "I was there at Normandy. I saw boys fall like wheat. And what carried us home wasn't victory, it was each other. Men like Sergeant Wren. They are the justice we claim to uphold." He turned, eyes locked on his son. "And today, I stand not as your father, but as a soldier, and I say with all due authority that you, Harold Whitman Jr., owe this man more than your robe can offer." The words landed like artillery. Judge Whitman looked down, then slowly, back up. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. The gallery didn't cheer, didn't clap. They simply stood, all of them. 100 veterans in black shirts, family members, strangers, General Caldwell, the media, court staff, all standing for Eli Wren, the Judge finally spoke. "I withdraw all charges, case dismissed. Sergeant Wren, you're free to go. No gavel, no theatrics, just words, and the thunderous sound of hundreds sitting back down, hearts lifted, justice glimpsed, silence broken as I..." Eli turned. He locked eyes with the elder Whitman. The old general nodded again, this time in peace. They left the courtroom like a procession, not triumphant, not celebratory, just quiet. Like soldiers walking away from a battlefield that never made sense to begin with. Eli stepped out into the sunlight. The crowd outside erupted, not with noise, but with presence. Cameras clicked, phones rose. Reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. He didn't need to. The world had already heard him. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He sat alone in his apartment, the lights off. The same photograph of his old squad on the table. The creases were deeper now. So were the scars. He didn't touch his phone for hours. When he finally turned it on, his inbox was flooded. Over 200 emails, messages from strangers, from fellow soldiers, from parents of the fallen. One said, "My brother took his life last year after being denied care. I wish he'd met you." Another, "I'm 14. I want to be like you when I grow up, not because you fought, but because you stayed kind." They kept coming, messages from across the country. Some handwritten letters were mailed to the VA center he volunteered at. Dozens, then hundreds. One from a widow in Missouri, one from a congressman in Maine, one from a 10-year-old girl whose father, a former Marine, hadn't spoken in 6 months, until he saw Eli on the news and whispered, "He gets it." But the one that broke him came in a plain envelope. No return address. Inside, a photograph, black and white, grainy. 3 soldiers in a foxhole. One of them, young, sharp-eyed, was Lieutenant General Harold Whitman Sr. On the back, in shaky handwriting, "We all carry ghosts. You just gave them a voice." Eli sat in silence, the letter trembling in his hands. The next day, he returned to the community center. His support group was waiting. The room had more chairs now, more faces, some familiar, some new. He didn't make a speech. He just sat down and passed around a notebook. "Write whatever you want," he said. "No filters. They did. That night, a 60-year-old vet from Detroit read his story aloud for the first time. A 22-year-old former medic cried in front of strangers and wasn't embarrassed. Someone brought a guitar. Someone brought a photo of a friend they lost. No press. No hashtags, just healing. Word spread. Honor after home tripled in size within a week, and somewhere in a quiet suburban house, Judge Whitman sat alone, rewatching the trial footage. Not the part where he dismissed the charges, the part where his father stood up. He hadn't spoken to him yet, but in his hands was a photo. 3 men, 1 battlefield, and in his ears, a voice he could no longer ignore. You owe this man more than your robe can offer. They left the courtroom like a procession, not triumphant, not celebratory, just quiet. Like soldiers walking away from a battlefield that never made sense to begin with. Eli stepped out into the sunlight. The crowd outside erupted, not with noise, but with presence. Cameras clicked, phones rose. Reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. He didn't need to. The world had already heard him. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He sat alone in his apartment, the lights off. The same photograph of his old squad on the table. The creases were deeper now. So were the scars. He didn't touch his phone for hours. When he finally turned it on, his inbox was flooded. Over 200 emails, messages from strangers, from fellow soldiers, from parents of the fallen. One said, "My brother took his life last year after being denied care. I wish he'd met you." Another, "I'm 14. I want to be like you when I grow up, not because you fought, but because you stayed kind." They kept coming, messages from across the country. Some handwritten letters were mailed to the VA center he volunteered at. Dozens, then hundreds. One from a widow in Missouri, one from a congressman in Maine, one from a 10-year-old girl whose father, a former Marine, hadn't spoken in 6 months, until he saw Eli on the news and whispered, "He gets it." But the one that broke him came in a plain envelope. No return address. Inside, a photograph, black and white, grainy. 3 soldiers in a foxhole. One of them, young, sharp-eyed, was Lieutenant General Harold Whitman Sr. On the back, in shaky handwriting, "We all carry ghosts. You just gave them a voice." Eli sat in silence, the letter trembling in his hands. The next day, he returned to the community center. His support group was waiting. The room had more chairs now. More faces, some familiar, some new. He didn't make a speech. He just sat down and passed around a notebook. "Write whatever you want," he said. No filters. They did. That night, a 60-year-old vet from Detroit read his story aloud for the first time. A 22-year-old former medic cried in front of strangers and wasn't embarrassed. Someone brought a guitar. Someone brought a photo of a friend they lost. No press. No hashtags, just healing. Word spread. Honor after home tripled in size within a week, and somewhere in a quiet suburban house, Judge Whitman sat alone, rewatching the trial footage. Not the part where he dismissed the charges, the part where his father stood up. He hadn't spoken to him yet, but in his hands was a photo. 3 men, 1 battlefield, and in his ears, a voice he could no longer ignore. You owe this man more than your robe can offer. 3 weeks after the trial, Eli stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, not to speak, not to protest, but to listen. Hundreds gathered beneath the gray marble sky. Some came in wheelchairs, others on crutches, some with service dogs, some with memories they hadn't shared in decades. It wasn't a rally. It was a song, not of music, but of story. Each person who stepped up took the mic and gave a name. A moment, a memory. Eli didn't organize it. They did. A young mother read a letter from her husband, written just days before he deployed and never came home. A man in a Navy cap read a poem he wrote in Vietnam and never showed anyone, not even his wife. A transgender veteran finally told her story and was met with applause, not silence. At the center of it all, Eli stood with no stage, no spotlight. Just a notebook, taking down every name, every unit, every hometown. He called it the living list. He promised these stories wouldn't disappear. With the help of others from Honor After Home, he launched a new project, a mobile archive that would travel across the country, collecting stories from veterans and their families. Not for the government, not for museums, for each other, for healing. The VA invited him to help restructure parts of its claims backlog system. Congress asked him to consult on a new bipartisan bill called the WREN Act, aimed at ensuring timely care for veterans suffering from PTSD and other trauma-related conditions. But Eli turned down most interviews. He didn't want to be the story. He wanted to help tell others, and so he did. In rural towns and busy cities, he sat with strangers in VFW halls, bus stops, homeless, shelters. He recorded their stories, scanned their photographs, wrote down names on paper like scripture. One night, in a town outside Phoenix, a man approached him after a group meeting. He was quiet, thin, face like ash and memory. "I'm Langford's driver," the man said. Eli didn't speak. "I quit the day he pressed charges," he added. "I saw what you did, what you stood for. He'll never understand. But I did. My brother never made it home." He handed Eli a folded paper. Inside, a snapshot of a 19-year-old boy in uniform, smiling, sunlight in his eyes. His name was Caleb. "Just say it somewhere loud enough for someone to hear." Eli nodded, and days later, in a meeting with 20 strangers and a guitar, he said it. Caleb, loud, steady, clear, and in the silence that followed, someone whispered, "We hear you." 2 years later, the new VA Center opened just outside Arlington. No cutting ribbon, no parading politicians, just a plaque on the wall. The Wren Room, in honor of every voice that rose through silence. Inside, veterans sat with counselors who had been trained not just in paperwork, but in presence. There were no lines out the door, no one begging to be seen, just people, scarred, healing, being met where they were. Eli didn't run the place. He refused the offer, but every Friday he came to volunteer. He never wore medals, never signed autographs. He carried the same notebook, still adding names. One day, a familiar face entered the center. Judge Harold Whitman, older, smaller somehow. Without his robe, he looked like any other man, except for the thin folder in his hands. He approached Eli slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. Eli looked at the folder. Inside, an application to volunteer. No fanfare, just a request to sit and listen. Eli took it, nodded once. No smile, no hostility, just space and silence. Outside, the sun cut through thick gray clouds. It was late autumn. The trees were bare, but the wind was warm. Eli stepped out, back where a memorial garden had begun to grow. A single bench overlooked a line of dog tags hanging from a steel bar. He sat, notebook in hand, pen steady, and beside one fresh tag etched with the name Caleb Marshall, he wrote, "He was way heard." In the distance, a child's laughter echoed through the open air. Eli looked up, smiled, just slightly, and closed the notebook. Not because the story was over, but because sometimes the final note isn't loud. It's the quiet that stays behind, the kind that lingers, like a promise, kept. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that silence can speak, and standing alone can light the way for many.